Governor Gavin Newsom just announced California is suing the Trump administration over yesterday's repeal of the EPA Endangerment Finding, the 2009 rule that gave the federal government authority to regulate greenhouse gases as pollutants. This isn't a symbolic lawsuit. This is California directly challenging the legal framework that could unravel vehicle emission standards, power plant regulations, and essentially every climate policy written in the last 15 years. The complaint is expected to hit federal court within 48 hours, and if California loses this fight, we're looking at a regulatory vacuum that could reshape everything from gas prices to air quality standards across the entire West Coast. Look, if you're here because you're tired of other channels giving you surface-level headlines and partisan talking points without actually explaining what any of this means for your daily life, I get it. That's exactly why I started this channel. No fluff, no clickbait promises, just straight information that helps you understand what's actually happening in California before everyone else figures it out. If that's what you're looking for, hit that subscribe button right now because we're diving deep into the most consequential environmental lawsuit California has filed in over a decade. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why this matters, whether you care about climate change or not. Now let's get into it. This isn't just another California versus Trump headline. The repeal of the EPA Endangerment Finding is a structural change to how environmental policy works in the United States, and California is the only state with the legal resources and political will to challenge it immediately. Here's the information threat you need to understand. If you're tracking California real estate, energy markets, or regulatory trends, this lawsuit will determine whether clean energy investments hold value or become stranded assets. It will decide whether automakers continue building electric vehicles for the California market or pivot back to combustion engines for federal compliance. It affects insurance rates, wildfire prevention funding, and air quality standards that directly impact property values in pollution-heavy regions. Every other outlet is covering this as environmental activism versus deregulation. That's surface-level analysis. The real story is California's attempt to weaponize state authority as a replacement for federal oversight. Newsom isn't just defending the endangerment finding, he's testing whether California can operate as a de facto regulatory nation-state, setting standards that force compliance regardless of what Washington does. This lawsuit is the opening move in a much larger strategy to decouple California's economy from federal environmental policy entirely. And here's the myth you need to stop believing right now. The myth that California can just set its own emission standards anyway, so the federal repeal doesn't matter. That's what people keep saying on social media, and it's fundamentally wrong. California's Clean Air Act waiver only works because the EPA Endangerment Finding established that greenhouse gases are pollutants in the first place. Without that federal determination, California's legal authority to impose stricter standards gets challenged in court. The repeal doesn't just remove federal rules, it undermines the legal scaffolding that California's entire regulatory framework depends on. That's why this lawsuit matters. That's why Newsom announced it within 24 hours of the repeal, because without that federal foundation, everything California has built starts crumbling. So let's start with what the endangerment finding actually is, because if you don't understand this, nothing else makes sense. The EPA Endangerment Finding was established in December 2009 under the Obama administration. It's a scientific determination that 6 greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride pose a danger to public health and welfare under the Clean Air Act. Now, this wasn't just symbolic paperwork. This finding gave the EPA legal authority to regulate these gases as pollutants, which became the foundation for the Clean Power Plan, vehicle fuel efficiency standards, and industrial emissions permits. Without it, the EPA has no statutory basis to treat greenhouse gases differently from any other atmospheric compound. Think about that for a second. The entire legal framework that allows the federal government to regulate carbon emissions depends on this one determination. It's like the keystone in an arch. Remove it, and everything else collapses. On February 11th and 12th, 2026, the Trump administration repealed this finding. The official justification is that they're restoring congressional authorities, arguing that unelected bureaucrats shouldn't make sweeping regulatory decisions. They're saying Congress should legislate climate policy, not the executive branch. And look, there's a legitimate debate about executive overreach and agency authority. But here's the practical effect that nobody's talking about. Every regulation built on the endangerment finding is now legally questionable. Automakers can challenge fuel efficiency standards. Power plants can challenge emissions permits. Industrial polluters can argue in court that the EPA has no authority to regulate their greenhouse gas output because the scientific basis for that regulation no longer exists. This isn't theoretical. This is happening right now. But here's where California enters the picture, and why Newsom's response is more calculated than it appears. On February 12, 2026, Newsom announced California would file suit in federal court to reverse the repeal. He called the action bogus, anti-science, and a direct threat to public health. The lawsuit will argue that the repeal violates the Clean Air Act's requirement for evidence-based determinations and that the administration ignored scientific consensus on climate change. California's legal argument rests on two pillars. First, that the original 2009 finding was based on comprehensive scientific review and hasn't been refuted by new evidence. Second, that repealing it without equivalent scientific justification is arbitrary and capricious under administrative law. California will likely invoke the Administrative Procedure Act, which requires federal agencies to provide reasoned explanations for policy reversals. The state is also expected to join with environmental groups in public nuisance claims, arguing the repeal directly harms California residents through increased pollution exposure. Now, here's what's not being reported, and this is important. California probably knows this lawsuit has a low probability of success in the current Supreme Court. The Roberts Court has been skeptical of broad agency authority since West Virginia versus EPA in 2022. They've consistently ruled that major policy questions require clear congressional authorization, not agency interpretation. So why file a lawsuit that you might lose? Because the lawsuit buys time. Discovery alone could take months. Preliminary injunctions could freeze implementation. Appeals could stretch into 2027 or beyond. During that window, California can accelerate its own regulatory infrastructure to create a parallel system that doesn't depend on federal cooperation. This isn't just defense, it's strategic delay while California builds autonomy. Newsom is playing chess while everyone else is arguing about checkers, but lawsuits are theoretical. Let's talk about the immediate, tangible risks the repeal creates for California residents, because this is where it gets personal. The most direct consequence of repealing the endangerment finding is reduced enforcement of air quality protections. California already has 9 of the 10 most polluted cities in the United States, according to American Lung Association data. Bakersfield, Fresno, Visalia, and parts of Los Angeles County routinely exceed federal particulate matter standards. If you live in any of these areas, you already know what I'm talking about. You've seen the brown haze hanging over the valley. You've felt it in your lungs on bad air quality days. You've watched asthma rates climb year after year. The endangerment findings supported regulations on diesel emissions, methane leaks from oil and gas operations, and industrial pollutants. Without it, enforcement becomes discretionary. The EPA can deprioritize inspections, delay penalty assessments, and grant extensions to non-compliant facilities. For California, this means ports, freight corridors, and agricultural regions, areas already struggling with asthma rates and respiratory illness, could see measurable declines in air quality within 6 to 12 months. This isn't fear-mongering, this is basic regulatory economics. When enforcement disappears, compliance drops. When compliance drops, pollution increases. Here's the health math, and I want you to really hear this. Increased particulate pollution correlates with higher rates of asthma, cardiovascular disease, and premature mortality. The California Air Resources Board estimates that vehicle emissions alone contribute to approximately 4,000 premature deaths annually in the state. 4,000 people every single year. If federal enforcement collapses and California's waiver authority gets challenged in court, we're looking at a scenario where pollution increases while the legal framework to combat it disintegrates. Newsom's lawsuit is framed as environmental protection, but it's also a public health emergency response. It's an attempt to preserve the regulatory tools that keep people alive. And it's not just health. The repeal triggers a cascade effect across California's entire regulatory economy. Let's talk about vehicle emission standards, because this is where the rubber literally meets the road. California's vehicle emissions standards are the strictest in the nation, covering everything from tailpipe emissions to zero-emission vehicle mandates. These standards exist because of a Clean Air Act waiver that allows California to exceed federal requirements. But that waiver is built on the assumption that the EPA recognizes greenhouse gases as pollutants. If that assumption disappears, the entire legal basis for California's standards becomes questionable. Automakers have already invested billions in electric vehicle infrastructure to comply with California's rules. General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis have production timelines designed around California's 2035 zero-emission vehicle mandate. These aren't small investments. We're talking about retooling entire factories, redesigning supply chains, and training workforces for a fundamental shift in manufacturing. If the endangerment finding repeal stands and California's waiver gets revoked, automakers face an impossible choice: retool for a national standard that no longer includes stringent emissions controls, or maintain separate production lines for California at massive cost. Neither option is cheap. Building two separate vehicle lines means duplicating engineering, testing, certification, and distribution. That's billions of dollars in additional overhead. The smart money says automakers hedge. They'll lobby for a middle ground, voluntary agreements that keep some emission standards in place without California's aggressive timelines. But if California wins the lawsuit and the endangerment finding is reinstated, manufacturers who scaled back electric vehicle production will be caught flat-footed. This is a high-stakes gamble where the wrong bet costs billions. Watch for automaker lobbying disclosures over the next 60 days. If they're funding both sides of this fight, you'll know they're playing both outcomes. They're buying influence with both the Trump administration and California lawmakers, trying to position themselves for whatever happens in court. But vehicles are only one piece. The repeal also opens the door to broader fossil fuel expansion, and this is where the oil and gas industry has been waiting for their moment. With the endangerment finding repealed, methane regulations, flaring restrictions, and carbon capture requirements all become optional. California has some of the strictest oil and gas rules in the country, but those rules depend on federal alignment to avoid interstate commerce challenges. California produces approximately 350 million barrels of oil annually, mostly from Kern County and offshore platforms. State rules require methane leak detection, flaring limits, and setback distances from residential areas. But if federal standards disappear, out-of-state operators can argue California is imposing discriminatory trade barriers. Legal challenges under the Dormant Commerce Clause become viable. Here's the industry playbook, and I've seen this play out before. Challenge California's rules as unconstitutional trade restrictions, argue the state is exceeding its authority without federal backing, and push for preemption. If even one federal court agrees, California's entire oil and gas regulatory framework collapses. Newsom's lawsuit is an attempt to preserve the federal foundation before those challenges gain traction. The timeline matters here. If California can keep the endangerment finding alive through injunctions, industry challenges stall. If the repeal stands, expect litigation floods by summer 2026. We're talking dozens of lawsuits targeting specific California regulations, each one designed to chip away at the state's authority piece by piece. And this is where the national implications start to become unavoidable. California isn't operating in isolation. 14 states follow California's vehicle emission standards through Section 177 of the Clean Air Act. New York, Massachusetts, Vermont, Washington, Oregon, Connecticut, Maine, Maryland, New Jersey, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Delaware, and Virginia all adopted California's standards. Combined, these states represent roughly 40% of the U.S. auto market. If California's waiver is revoked, those states lose their framework too. They either revert to weaker federal standards or face legal challenges for maintaining stricter rules without California's leadership. This is where the lawsuit becomes a national battle. If Newsom succeeds in court, he preserves not just California's authority, but the entire multi-state emissions coalition. If he fails, we're looking at regulatory fragmentation. Some states attempt independent standards and get sued, others capitulate, and the national auto market fractures into competing jurisdictions. The most likely outcome? A messy patchwork where litigation defines compliance on a case-by-case basis for the next 3 to 5 years. Automakers will be navigating 50 different regulatory environments with no clear federal guidance. It's going to be chaos, so where does this leave us in practical terms? Here's what you need to understand. The EPA Endangerment Finding a repeal is not a climate debate, it's a structural dismantling of the legal authority that underpins 15 years of environmental regulation. Newsom's lawsuit is California's attempt to preserve that authority through judicial intervention. But the real story is what happens while the case works through the courts. California is accelerating its own regulatory independence, building a system that can function without federal cooperation. The lawsuit buys time. The outcome matters less than the transition period. For California residents, the immediate impacts are air quality decline in pollution-heavy regions, uncertainty in the auto industry, and potential insurance and property value shifts tied to climate risk. If you're buying property in Fresno or Bakersfield, air quality trends are going to affect long-term values. If you're working in the automotive supply chain, the next 6 months will determine whether your job exists in 2 years. For investors, this creates volatility in clean energy stocks, automaker equities, and real estate markets dependent on emission standards. For policymakers, this is a stress test of federalism. Can a single state operate as a regulatory counterweight to the federal government indefinitely? Here's what to watch in the next 30 days, and I'm giving you specific markers because these are the signals that tell you which way this is heading. First, watch the court docket. If California files for a preliminary injunction and gets a favorable ruling from a Ninth Circuit judge, the repeal gets frozen while litigation proceeds. That's the best case scenario for emission standard stability. It means the status quo holds while the case moves forward. Second, watch automaker statements. If major manufacturers announce production delays or electric vehicle investment pullbacks, that's a signal they're betting against California in court. They're hedging their exposure by slowing down commitments to electric infrastructure. Third, watch state legislatures. If New York or Washington introduce bills to create independent emissions frameworks that don't rely on California's waiver, that's a sign the multi-state coalition is fracturing. It means those states are preparing for a world where California's authority disappears and they need their own legal foundation. Fourth, watch the Supreme Court's docket. If the Trump administration fast-tracks an appeal to bypass lower courts, we could get a final ruling by late 2026. That accelerates the timeline significantly and removes the strategic delay California is counting on. Fifth, watch California's budget proposals. If Newsom allocates emergency funding for air quality enforcement or pollution monitoring, that's preparation for a scenario where federal support disappears entirely. It's California building parallel infrastructure to replace federal resources. If you want to stay ahead of California's regulatory shifts, legal battles, and the economic fallout from federal policy changes, this is the channel that tracks it in real time. No fluff, no partisan spin, just the information you need to make informed decisions about where California is heading. Subscribe if that's valuable to you. The next 30 days are going to move fast, and most outlets won't connect the dots until it's already too late. I'll be here breaking it down as it happens.